This is Dennis Rasmussen, who's a professor of political science at Tufts University, about 15 minutes away.
It took me maybe 18 hours to get here.
Our close neighbor, it took you 18?
Yes.
That's precision. And he graduated in 2000, year 2000, from Michigan State, where he was a student at the James Madison Honors College. And he went to Duke and got a PhD from Duke in 2005. This is his third book that we're going to discuss today. The other two are first Problems and Promise of Commercial Society, Adam Smith's response to Rousseau, that came out in 2009, and then another one on Cambridge Press in 2014 on Pragmatic Enlightenment. Not the radical, but the pragmatic.
Exactly. Contesting the radical enlightenment. Yes.
Yeah, I see, right. So, recovering the liberalism of Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. And then the one we're going to discuss today, The Infidel and the Professor. Here it is. Got nicely reviewed in England. Instead of a book of the week for the Times Higher Education Supplement. So, this is David Hume and Adam Smith, the friendship that shaped modern thought. We'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah. But, so he's going to talk for a bit, and then or for a time, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussions and questions.
Okay, thank you, Harvey. Thank you for inviting me, and of course, thanks to you all for coming. I'm glad to be here. So as Harvey said, I'm talking about my new book, kind of hot off the presses, The Infidel and the Professor, David Hume, Adam Smith, and the Friendship that Shaped Modern Thought. And I'll pass this around in case any of you want to take a look while I'm talking here. So this is, amazingly to me, the first book ever to center on Hume and Smith's friendship. So it just kind of chronologically follows the course of their friendship from their first meeting in 1749 until Hume's death in 1776, and then I try to look at both their personal relationship as well as their intellectual relationship, the ideas. It's of course absolutely remarkable that two thinkers of this stature were best friends for their entire adult lives. Hume's widely regarded as the greatest philosopher ever to write in English, maybe second to Hobbes, depending on what kind of philosophy you're talking about, but certainly one of the greatest philosophers ever to write in English. Smith is almost certainly history's most famous theorist of commercial society. And in fact, I argue that theirs was the greatest friendship in the entire history of philosophy. This became something of a parlor game that I played with fellow academics while I was writing the book, right? So what was the greatest friendship in the history of philosophy? And I'd be glad to play it with you all after my talk, if you'd like. So my primary aim in writing the book was just to try to tell the story of this remarkable friendship in an accessible, hopefully at least entertaining way, in hopes of reaching as broad of an audience as possible. And as Harvey kindly said, it's got a review in the New York Times. There's one coming up in the Wall Street Journal. So at least it's getting some attention, which is a big part of what I wanted to do, is to tell the story of the friendship as a story. So I talked about the book a number of times to primarily non-academic audiences, like at the Harvard bookstore a few weeks ago. And there I tried to emphasize the elements of the book that I think, or at least hope, make it a reasonably compelling read. So Hume's, I think, very engaging sense of humor, the constant clashes, Hume's constant clashes with the pious of their time, the scandal surrounding Hume's irreligious death, and their encounters with a bunch of the other luminaries of the age, not just in Scotland, but also people like Rousseau, Voltaire, Gibbon, Burke, Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Johnson, James Boswell. They kind of hit a lot of the high notes of the 18th century. And I simply always love reading books that combine biography and philosophy, especially, they manage to impart some ideas, but also tell a good story. So I decided to try my hand at writing one. You're all graduate students, so I certainly wouldn't recommend doing this before tenure, but, it was a great delight to do. Once you do get tenure, it's been easily the greatest delight in my writing career thus far. But at the same time, I also wanted to, while I'm telling this story, to contribute to the scholarly literature on Hume and Smith. And it's that side of the book that I'll focus on mostly today for obvious reasons. So I'm going to touch on 7 areas where I think my book makes a contribution to scholarly literature, or at least pushes the scholarly conversation in a slightly different direction. The first 5 I'll run through pretty quickly. I think they're fairly straightforward and controversial, and then I'll linger a little bit longer on the last 2, which I think will be fairly controversial among Hume and Smith scholars. So first and most obviously, the book provides the fullest account yet of Hume's and Smith's personal and intellectual relationship. My primary source in writing the book, of course, is the full range of their works. As I try to show, there are lots of references to Hume, both implicit and explicit, throughout basically every single thing Smith wrote. The reverse is less true. Hume is older of the 2 by a dozen years. He wrote mostly in the early part of his career. He composed almost all of his writings before Smith even began to publish his. We do get comments. Hume writes an anonymous review of the theory of moral sentiments and their comments on one another's works, but for the most part, it's Smith's works engaging with Hume's rather than the other way around. I also analyzed their correspondence. Unfortunately, neither one, especially Smith, is a terrible correspondent. Neither one's a great correspondent. There are unfortunately only 56 surviving letters between them, but I mine those for what I can. I draw on a host of other contemporaneous, near-contemporaneous sources. And I think, despite the relative lack of correspondence between them, I think there's enough there to give a reasonably full account of their, again, personal and intellectual relationship, even without resorting to the kind of speculation that often tempts historians when sources are thin. Second, and on a related note, the book provides the first systematic treatment of Smith's responses to Hume's thought over his entire career. From his first writing was an essay on the history of astronomy, which was written by 1746, although not published until after his death, and then go all the way through the final revisions of the theory of moral sentiments, which came out in 1790. So, as I said, the influence of Hume is apparent in everything Smith wrote. But that's not to say that that Smith ever really adopted Hume's views wholesale. On the contrary, he's constantly modifying everything he touches, taking something from Hume and adapting it in some way. And there have been a number of articles, a number of book chapters that have looked at Hume's influence on Smith with respect to a particular issue, particular question. So there are lots of articles of Hume and Smith on sympathy, Hume and Smith on justice, and the like, but none that examine their relationship in anything like a comprehensive manner. So throughout the book, I look at Smith's responses to Hume on a wide variety of topics, starting with the astronomy essay, on epistemology and religion, sympathy, utility, justice, and religion once again in the theory of moral sentiments, economics and politics in Smith's jurisprudence lectures, in The Wealth of Nations, politics once again, the advantages and drawbacks of commercial society, benefits of free trade, question of church establishment in the American conflict, and then yet again religion and kind of broader questions of virtue in the final revisions of the theory of moral sentiments. So again, just a wide variety of Smith's responses to Hume. Third, so for much of the 20th century, Smith's moral philosophy was seen as little more than a series of footnotes to Hume's. But I argue that his version of moral sentimentalism, in fact, incorporates a number of improvements on Hume's. So, as I kind of already indicated, virtually the whole of the theory of moral sentiment shows signs of Hume's influence, down to the very examples that Smith uses are often ones taken straight from the treatise of the Second Inquiry. And the similarities between their views, their moral theories, are of course broad and deep. So they both see morality as an eminently practical human phenomenon, not one based on any kind of sacred, mysterious, or otherworldly authority. They both say that morality derives from human sentiments rather than reason, and both posit that right and wrong are established by the sentiments that we feel when we adopt the proper perspective, one that corrects for biases, personal biases, and misinformation. So this is Hume's general point of view or common point of view, and Smith's impartial spectator. So, despite all these big, broad, deep, fundamental similarities, I show in chapter 5 of the book that Smith deviated from Hume's moral theory on 4 major topics. First is the nature of sympathy, what sympathy entails. So, Smith argues that sympathy almost always entails a kind of imaginative projection into the situation of another person, not this straightforward, Hume sometimes even calls it an emotional contagion, where you kind of just catch the feelings of other people. Second, the role of utility, which Smith argues plays, in fact, a much smaller role in moral judgment than Hume claims. Third is the foundation of justice. So Smith argues that justice springs from not from reflection on its usefulness, as Hume contends, but rather from the sentiment of resentment. So it's a natural, not an artificial virtue for Smith. And finally, the effects of religion, which Hume argues has more practical benefits than Smith argues has more practical benefits than Hume allows. So in all of these cases, Smith's views are more nuanced, more sophisticated, I think arguably more persuasive than Hume's are. I moved quickly through a bunch of stuff right there. I'd be happy to talk more about any of these points later if you'd like. On the other hand, and this is point number 4, I also argue that just as Smith's contributions to moral philosophy have been unduly neglected in favor of Hume's, similarly Hume's contributions to political economy have been unduly neglected in favor of Smith's. So taken as an economist, Hume has long been seen as a minor predecessor of Smith insofar as he's taken notice of it all. But in fact, he argued for free trade, he stressed the moral, social, political benefits of commerce several decades before The Wealth of Nations appeared. It's amazing how much of that book draws on Hume's insights. Hume's essay Of Luxury, the one that's now usually known as Of Refinement in the Arts, is I think one of the most forceful, comprehensive, and yet succinct defenses of the whole modern liberal commercial order that's ever been written. Again, I argue in chapter 9 that a great deal of or at least many of the central arguments of the Wealth of Nations draw on, or build on, at least Hume's insights. Here too, I stress that Smith diverged from Hume in important respects, above all in being much more ready to acknowledge potential dangers and drawbacks of commercial society. So Smith acknowledges, for instance, that commercial society necessarily produces great inequalities, that an extensive division of labor can exact an immense cost in human dignity by making people feeble and ignorant, that wealth and material goods can corrupt people's moral sentiments, that wealthy merchants and manufacturers will often collude against the public interest, and that the desire for wealth often leads people to submit themselves to endless toil and anxiety in the pursuit of frivolous material goods that provide only fleeting satisfaction. Now, none of this is to say that Smith didn't ultimately defend commercial society. Of course he did. He absolutely did. I tried to show in my first book that Harvey mentioned at the outset, the one on Smith's response to Rousseau's critique of commercial society, that Smith essentially insists that commercial society's faults, though real and important, aren't as numerous or as great as those of other forms of society. So as I read him, Smith offers us a kind of historical comparative cost-benefit analysis and says, well, despite its very real problems, commercial society's overall balance sheet, it remains preferable to those of the alternatives. It's a definite improvement over the poverty, insecurity, dependence that dominated basically all pre-commercial ages. So in other words, Smith agrees with Hume that the benefits of commercial society, liberty, security, prosperity, and the rest, vastly outweigh the costs, but he's far more willing than Hume is to admit that there are costs involved and to try to seek ways to ameliorate them. Fifth, I provide the fullest account yet of the abuse that Smith suffered as a result of his published work, the letter to William Strahan. So for those of you who might know, this is an ostensible letter, a public letter on Hume's last days, death, and character that was published alongside Hume's brief autobiography, My Own Life, in 1777. So this is, surprisingly to even many Smith scholars, this is the only work of Smith's beyond his 2 books that he published under his name during his lifetime. And it proved immensely controversial because of Hume's entirely deserved reputation for impiety. So in the letter, Smith chronicles, some would even say flaunts, Hume's kind of cheerfulness and equanimity during his final days when many were expecting him to be distraught, with none of the consolations of the afterlife and the like. He concludes the letter by describing his unbelieving friend as a paragon of wisdom and virtue, and this generated outrage among the devout. So Smith later famously commented that this work, the letter to Strahan, brought on me 10 times more abuse than the very violent attack I made on the entire commercial system of Great Britain. Now, virtually all Smith scholars are familiar with this line because of the very colorful reference to the Wealth of Nations, right? But far fewer, in fact, almost none, know the precise nature and extent of the abuse that Smith did suffer as a result of his tribute to Hume. And so in chapter 12, I document the often quite vicious reactions to the letter to Strahan, led by a guy named George Horne, a prominent cleric, but also Samuel Johnson, James Boswell, Edmund Burke, many others, starting from just after the letter's publication and continuing well into the 19th century. Okay, so these are the first 5 contributions to the book that I think should be relatively straightforward. I'm going to slow down a bit for the last 2, which challenge the received views to a much greater extent. So first, or I suppose sixth, Smith's religious views have been the subject of a great deal of scholarly controversy and debate. This is one of the kind of hottest topics in Smith scholarships at the moment. And I argue that his views are substantially closer to Hume's, meaning substantially more skeptical than is usually assumed. This isn't to say at all that Smith was an atheist. I think it's very likely that he was not, that he believed in a distant, perhaps benevolent higher power, but he was also almost certainly not a believing Christian, and I think he was skeptical of most forms of religious belief and devotion. I end up in the book describing him as a skeptical deist, as opposed to an outright skeptic like Hume. So one of the kind of running themes of the book is the divergence between Hume and Smith with respect to the public postures that they adopted with respect to religion. So Hume is fairly forthright about his lack of faith. Smith generally went to great lengths in both his writings and his personal life to avoid revealing much about his religious beliefs or lack thereof. And these contrary postures led to equally contrary reputations. Hume was christened the Great Infidel. He was deemed unfit to teach the young. He twice applied for professorships, one at Edinburgh, one at Glasgow. In both cases, his candidacy was decisively opposed by the clergy. Whereas Smith, who's much quieter on this score, becomes a very widely respected professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow. And so this is the contrast implicit in the title, right? The infidel and the professor. So this reading of Smith as fairly skeptical with regard to religion, again, a kind of skeptical deist, runs counter to the views of, I think, counter to the views of most Smith scholars. I won't say the scholarly consensus. I don't think there is a consensus. You have views ranging from, he's a good Christian to he's a closet atheist. I'm definitely more on the skeptical side, though. And this might seem to be contradicted by a number of passages in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, where Smith appears to pretty straightforwardly endorse the idea of a providential God directing things. So let me say a bit more about this, why I see him as more skeptical than many do. So it's true that Smith periodically invokes the idea of a providential order in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, or TMS, as I'll call it for short, but Smith scholars refer to it. He generally describes the religious impulse in fairly sympathetic terms. So far more than Hume, he depicts the belief in God and the belief in an afterlife as having important practical benefits. It provides consolation, it buttresses morality, and so on. On the other hand, none of his core arguments in the book ultimately depend on religious premises. On the contrary, I think one of the central purposes of his moral theory, like Hume's moral theory, is to show that morality ultimately comes from us, comes from human beings themselves, rather than from the word or will of God. Moreover, most of the passages that do invoke a providential order, or if you look closely, somewhat evasively or ambiguously worded, or kind of hedged with qualifications. So Smith is constantly saying, well, we suppose God does this, or it seems that God does this. And in many, I would say most of these passages, what he's focusing on is less God than on our beliefs about God. What he's really putting forward, I think, is a theory of human nature, a kind of commentary on our intellectual, emotional needs. Further, there's good reason to believe that TMS was crafted in large part from Smith's lectures to his students on moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. And it's simply expected in 18th century Scotland that professors, especially professors of moral philosophy, would be sufficiently religious. Again, that's why Hume wasn't able to become one. One of Smith's first actions on arriving at Glasgow was to be asked to be freed from the customary duty of opening each class with a prayer. That request was denied. So certainly he couldn't have given openly irreligious lectures to his students, and I think similar pressures would have kept him from publishing an overtly irreligious book while he remained a professor. On a very much related note, it's also worth pointing out that TMS became less religious over time, so a number of the revisions that Smith made to the book later in life served to temper or soften the religious undertones of the first edition. The first softening of the religious undertones, I think it's important to notice, came in the third edition of 1767. This is the first one that was published after he left his position at Glasgow, and all of the religious duties and expectations that attended it. I doubt that's a coincidence. And then the final sixth edition of 1790, that gets very extensive revisions, is less religious still. So I think there's some evidence even within and surrounding TMS itself that gives us reason to believe that Smith wasn't quite as committed or ardent of a believer as he's often thought to have been. But my main reasons for thinking that he's skeptical of most forms of religious belief and devotion come from his other works, other things we know about. So basically everything else that we know about Smith beyond TMS point to him being more skeptical than you might expect based on a reading of that work. Some of the evidence, as I said, comes from his personal life, his correspondence. Contemporaries are always saying, commenting that throughout his life, Smith is very guarded in conversation when the topic of religion comes up. He was famously caught and punished for reading Hume's treatise while he was a student at Oxford, so his interest in skeptical philosophy certainly started early. Again, when he became a professor at Glasgow, he asked to be released from having to open each day's class with a prayer. He wasn't able to do that, but he did manage to dispense with the practice, the usual practice of his predecessor, Francis Hutcheson, of delivering a religious discourse to the students every Sunday. And his correspondence is just full of offhand comments and jokes and ironic asides that seem to me to indicate a general lack of piety. I'm not going to run through all of them right now. I'll just take a couple examples connected to Hume. This is the subject of the book. So at one point, kind of late in life, Smith is writing a letter of introduction, a letter to Hume, a letter of introduction for one of his Genevan friends, a guy named Charles Bonnet. And he tells Hume, you know, this Bonnet guy, you'll really like him. He's one of the best-natured, worthiest, best-hearted of men. Notwithstanding, he's one of the most religious. As Hume lay dying, Smith wrote to their mutual friend, Alexander Wedderburn, that Hume was dying, and said, quote, with great cheerfulness and good humor, with more real resignation to the necessary course of things than any whining Christian ever died with pretending resignation to the will of God. So this correspondence, I think, pushes in that direction. There's also further evidence in Smith's other writings beyond TMS. So, as I mentioned before, his earliest surviving work, this essay on the history of astronomy, was, at least as I read it, pretty deeply skeptical in character. So, at one point in the work, it's mostly about science and the kind of rise of science, but at one point he makes a similar argument that he makes about science, about religion. So he offers a sort of conjectural history. Well, where does religion come from? And he starts with polytheistic beliefs. He says that people imagined or invented these beliefs in order to explain this seemingly inexplicable and thereby satisfy their mind, like the kind of human craving for order. Then he conjectures, well, how did these polytheistic beliefs transform into monotheism? And he says essentially that the desire to explain the world as a coherent whole, to find something linking the various phenomena of the nature of the world, natural world, led to this. He doesn't really quite come out and say it, but he does seem to see this idea too, the idea that the world is a coherent whole that needs a unified explanation, that this too is, as he calls it, an invention of the imagination, driven by human desires. So nothing in that he says in the essay exactly rules out the idea of a higher power or an ordered world, an intelligent designer, but certainly the whole work has a distinctly deflationary character. It gives very unflattering psychological, sociological explanations for beliefs that were widely thought to emanate from reason, if not from God himself. And in fact, as I point out, the basic argument he's making in this section of the essay anticipates Hume's natural history of religion to an almost eerie degree. They're kind of parallel passages saying almost the same thing. Moreover, Smith's other published work, The Wealth of Nations, is pretty strikingly secular in language and outlook. There are none of the invocations of a providential order that you find in TMS. In fact, in the book's 900 plus pages, Smith never once refers to God or the author of nature or providence. He mentions the deity twice, but only in the context of describing the subjects of study in the classical world and medieval universities. In the one section of the book dedicated to religion, or rather the question of religious establishment, whether to have an established church, the only authorities whom he cites are Machiavelli, Hume, and Voltaire, none of whom are exactly noted for their piety. His scattered comments on the moral, social, political effects of Christianity are generally very critical. He derides the monkish virtues just as Hume had. He depicts religious superstition and enthusiasm as great dangers to liberty and good government. As I've already mentioned, some Smith scholars think of the 6th edition of Theory of Moral Sentiments almost as a separate work. There's so much added compared to the first version. As I mentioned, the extensive revisions that you get in 1790 make it to make it a much less religious work. And finally, there's once again the letter to Strahan, right, where Smith insists that Hume, this avowed skeptic, is an absolute model of wisdom and virtue that raises such indignation among the devout. It shocked every sober Christian, in just one contemporary comment. So, to me, I mean, it's hard to read the letter to Strahan as anything other than a defense, at least an implicit defense of the morality of a life without religion. His model of wisdom and virtue isn't Jesus or a Christian saint, but rather the unbeliever Hume. So, when you add all of this up, it seems to me likely that Smith was less religious than is often assumed. Again, even if he plays his cards a lot closer to the vest than Hume does on this score. This, of course, raises the question of why exactly Smith was so much more reticent than Hume was on this question. It's hard to answer this with much certainty, the removal of well over 2 centuries, but I think it's pretty easy to imagine a number of possibilities. So, for instance, it's possible that Smith was simply temperamentally disposed to be more circumspect than Hume was. Maybe he had more concern for his reputation, for kind of career, professional success. Maybe he saw religion is less important of a phenomenon, less dangerous of a phenomenon than Hume did. Maybe he thought the dangers of religion would be better combated through quiet neglect rather than open confrontation. Maybe he just wanted to avoid offending his pious mother, very pious Presbyterian, with whom he was especially close. He lived with his mother for most of his life. Maybe he just learned a lesson from Hume's unhappy encounters with the devout. And of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. I'm guessing many of them are true, more than one of them. So at any rate, that's why I read Hume as more skeptical than many do with regard to religion. So turning to my last point, if my reading of Smith on religion kind of pushes the received interpretation toward one end of an existing spectrum, the final aspect of the book that I want to highlight in my remarks today totally overturns or tries to overturn the scholarly consensus, flipping it 180 degrees. So as some of you might know, Smith resolutely refused to oversee the posthumous publication of Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, despite Hume's request that he do so. And it's basically universally accepted among scholars. I haven't really seen anyone who disagrees with this, that this episode significantly tarnished Hume and Smith's friendship, caused Hume great pain during his final months, and Smith's behavior in this instance is generally seen as unnecessarily cautious, utterly inexplicable, or even an act of betrayal. Right? It's a denial of his best friend's dying wish. And these views are common even among scholars who are ordinarily very highly sympathetic to Smith. So Nicholas Phillipson, who's the author of the most recent, most popular biography of Smith, comments, I'm just going to read a few quotes here. Phillipson comments that Smith's behavior in the last weeks of his closest friend's life is not easy to fathom, that his refusal to publish the dialogues cast a shadow over their relationship in the last weeks of Hume's life. Ian Simpson Ross, who wrote the quote-unquote definitive scholarly biography of Smith, agrees that Smith's actions must have troubled Hume on his deathbed, and that Smith erred on the side of prudence at the expense of benevolence towards Hume. Ryan Hanley, who's a recent president of the Adam Smith Society, too maintains that Hume and Smith's otherwise unblemished friendship was marred by this incident. And finally, Gavin Kennedy, who runs a popular blog on Smith, insists that Smith behaved less than loyally to Hume and that the whole episode leaves a bad taste. I admire the work of each of these scholars, but I have to say that I disagree with all of these claims. I argue in chapter 10 of the book that this episode was in fact far less acrimonious, far less philosophically charged than is generally assumed, and that if anything, Hume is more in the wrong in this episode than Smith was. So I'll just start with a kind of brief overview of the evidence and try to explain why I see this so differently than everyone else seems to. In the book, I go through the evidence in pretty excruciating detail, kind of every back and forth, every comment they make in their correspondence about the dialogues. For the purpose of this talk, I'll spare you that and just focus on some of the big points, the highlights. So first of all, it's important to note that Hume wrote the first draft of the dialogue quite early in his career, in the early 1750s. He returned to it several times in subsequent years, including putting on a few finishing touches just before he died in 1776. It's not clear when Smith first read the work. Looking at the evidence, my guess would be the early 1760s. At all events, we know that he knew he had read it well before 1776. So the stage is set for this exchange between Hume and Smith on the fate of the dialogues. When Hume is dying of colon cancer, he realizes he's not going to recover from this illness, draws up a new will in January 1776. He names Smith his literary executor and asks him, among other things, to publish the dialogues. Smith at the time was not, Hume was in Edinburgh, Smith was in London seeing the Wealth of Nations through the press. It came out in March of that year. So he didn't learn about Hume's request until a few months later when they kind of fortuitously ran into each other on the road between London and Edinburgh. We don't know, of course, because this is in person, but Smith seems to express some reservations about publishing the dialogues at this meeting, because as soon as Hume gets to London, he writes Smith and he says, okay, don't worry, you don't have to publish the dialogues, but your scruples are groundless, you really ought to do it. And Smith responds, and he's like, sure, okay, I'll be happy to receive a copy, I'll make sure it's preserved, but I'm not going to publish it. So Hume says, okay, forget asking Smith to do it, I'm going to ask my publisher, the principal publisher, William Strahan, ask him to see it through the press. Strahan eventually says yes, so Hume changes his will, so he says, well, I'm going to leave the property of the dialogues to Strahan. If he doesn't publish it within 2 years, then I ask that my nephew do so. His nephew also may be with Hume to publish it. So he dies. After that, he dies. Strahan and Smith confer about it. Smith says, yes, it's a very nice work, it's very finely written, but he says, I could have wished it had remained in manuscript to be communicated only to a few people. I'm resolved for many reasons to have no concern in the publication of those dialogues. He doesn't spell it out in this letter, what are these many reasons. He at least hints what these reasons are in later correspondence with Strahan, where he says that he's uneasy about the clamor which I foresee the dialogues will excite, and a clamor that would affect his own quiet, as he calls it, and the sales of the planned new edition of Hume's collected works. So Smith avoids all connection with the work. Strahan, as I just said, promised Hume that he would see the work through the press. Once he gets a hold of it, he says, no, I'm not going to do it either. So his nephew duly sees it through the press 2 years later. Now, another thing recent scholarship has been nearly unanimous about is in saying that when it was finally published, the dialogues brought none of the expected outcry, that it was just, nobody really was bothered by it. This is in James Harris's recent biography of Hume. This is, again, almost everybody says this. And this claim is based on just one letter that we have from Hugh Blair, written pretty early on. If you look at the periodicals of the time, this is just not right. So the first major review of the book, in September 1779, the critical review comments that if Hume's pernicious principles will not prevail, they would throw gloom over the whole creation and really terminate in the blind amazement, the diffidence and melancholy of mankind. That same month, the London Magazine declares baldly that Hume's outlook terminates in atheism. It laments that he left no sincere friend behind him who had so much regard for his character as to bury the dialogues with him. The Monthly Review, for its part, insists that Hume sought to establish principles whereby the wicked are set free from every restraint but that of the laws, the virtuous are robbed of their most substantial comforts, every generous ardor of the human mind is damped, the world we live in is a fatherless world, we're chained down to a life full of wretchedness and misery, and we have no hope beyond the grave. The London Review was the sole periodical to issue a reasonably favorable review and came under attack from its readers for doing so. As far afield as Germany, one periodical regretted that Hume had flung such stains on the otherwise so beautiful canvas of his character and warned young men not yet practiced in thinking against a precipitate reading of this book. So, what are we to make of this episode? To begin with, I think there's little evidence to support the common claim that the disagreement between Hume and Smith over the dialogues is particularly acrimonious. So Hume is clearly partial to the work, he's clearly anxious to see it published, but the idea that Smith refused to take on this responsibility caused him great pain, significantly tarnished their friendship, seems decidedly exaggerated. In fact, Hume's feelings of affection towards Smith don't seem to have diminished in the slightest. So for instance, right in the middle of this alleged feud between the two, Hume had Smith stay at his house for over a month, from the time he returned to Edinburgh on July 3rd through mid-August, just a couple of weeks before Hume died. That August, Smith asked Hume's permission to supplement Hume's recently completed autobiography, My Own Life, with an account of his illness and death. This is what became the Strahan that I talked about earlier. And Hume readily gave him complete discretion on this score. He writes, "You're too good in thinking any trifles that concern me are so much worth your attention, but I give you entire liberty to make what additions you please to the account of my life." Now, his tone here is kind of cheerfully complacent, but this is no small proposition that he's accepting. My Own Life is, after all, Hume's final message to his readers. It was going to serve as a preface to all future editions of his collected works. So his immediate willingness to give Smith an entire liberty regarding such a central feature of his posthumous legacy, I think, reveals an extraordinarily high degree of trust and confidence. His last letter to Smith both opens and closes by calling him my dearest friend. So clearly, I think none of this suggests a serious falling out or deep-seated feelings of resentment. The main question confounding most scholars, though, is why Smith was so adamant in his refusal to publish the dialogues. And I think the difficulty of comprehending Smith's behavior has been heightened by two factors. One is that Smith himself emphasizes the sanctity of deathbed wishes in his jurisprudence lectures. He says that we naturally find a pleasure in remembering the last words of a friend and in executing his last injunctions, in part because we realize how much we'd be distressed to see our last injunctions not performed. So why then, many have wondered, would Smith refuse a request that his best friend made, if not on his deathbed, at least during his final illness, right, in his flu? Adding to the mystery is the extremely high regard in which Hume's dialogues is now held. Leading scholars have called it one of the glories of the Scottish and indeed the European Enlightenment, beyond any question the greatest work on the philosophy of religion in the English language, perhaps the most remarkable treatise upon this subject ever composed, Hume's Philosophical Testament, and the epitome of his life's work. So, how in the world could Smith have refused to publish a work of such obvious greatness? One, to me, surprisingly common answer to these questions has been, well, Smith simply objected to the contents of the dialogues. He was disturbed, maybe scandalized by the work. He saw it as deeply incompatible with his own philosophy. He was personally unable to come to grips with Hume's barrage of skepticism. Now, if Smith's religious views were as close to Hume's as I think they were, as I suggest they were in the book, then this, of course, seems unlikely. Given the letter to Strahan and all of this, it seems to me very unlikely that he was overly disturbed by Hume's skepticism. And my general reading of Smith's stance toward religion and toward Hume's skepticism is in fact corroborated, I think, by some of his statements and actions with regard to the dialogues itself. So over the course of his exchange with Hume, he says time and again, I'm very happy to take every possible measure to make sure that the work is most carefully preserved. He also says it's very finely written. He just says that I wish it had remained in manuscript to be communicated only to a few people. So in other words, he had no problem circulating the work among friends. In fact, Smith did. He actively disseminated the work himself. We don't know exactly how widely, but we have a letter from the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, this is the moralist's great-great-great-grandson, thanking Smith for sending a copy of the work to him in France right after it's published. So Smith himself helps him disseminate the work. I think the likeliest explanation for Hume's refusal to publish the dialogues is also the simplest. He himself basically says this in his correspondence with Strahan. He's wary of the public clamor that he thinks the dialogues is going to provoke and the effects that this clamor will have on his own quiet, as he calls it, and on Hume's posthumous reputation. So Smith, throughout his life, is always far more wary of public controversy than Hume was. That comes out in the Rousseau quarrel, the Hume quarrel with Rousseau, where Smith said, don't publish anything about this. And I think it's frankly thoroughly unsurprising that he would exercise greater caution with respect to a work like the dialogue. So was this then an instance of excessive caution or even cowardice, as is often suggested? So first of all, I'd say if it was, then it's not a failing that was unique to Smith. Every single one of Hume's friends who knew about the work told him not to publish it, at least if the surviving record is anything to go by. So Gilbert Elliot, who's a member of Parliament and one of Hume's good friends, we know opposed publication. We have a letter from Hume to Elliot in which he complains, "Is it not hard and tyrannical in you not to allow me to publish my dialogues? Pray do not think that a proper dedication may atone for what's exceptional in them." Hugh Blair, who's another friend, a leading moderate minister, likewise admonished Hume, "For God's sake, let that be a posthumous work, if ever it shall see the light, though I really think it had better not." We have a report that Adam Ferguson, too, remonstrated against publishing the work. And of course, William Strahan, who's Hume's publisher, is close to him personally as well as professionally, ultimately declined to publish the work. And this after, unlike Smith, he had promised Hume to do so, and he still ended up not doing so. And even if the unanimous counsel of some of Hume's closest friends isn't enough to exonerate Smith from charges of cowardice, I think that Hume's own words and actions should be. After all, despite Hume's greater willingness to court controversy compared to Smith, and despite his obvious fondness for the dialogues, he himself had refrained from publishing the work for 2.5 decades. He didn't even mention the manuscript's existence to his publisher until just a couple months before his death. He may have pondered publication from time to time, as the letter to Gilbert Elliot that I just quoted suggests, but he realized that it would be an audacious move even for him, hence his acknowledgement in that letter that there's something exceptional about the work that would need a proper dedication to atone for. I think most striking of all is Hume's explanation in his letter. He wrote a letter to Strahan in June 1776 telling him about the dialogues, asking him to publish it, and he explains in this letter why he didn't publish long ago. Again, they had been sitting on it for 2.5 decades. Hume writes, I'm going to read a couple sentences here. I have hitherto forborne to publish it, the dialogues, because I was of late desirous to live quietly and keep remote from all clamor. For though it not be more exceptionable than some things I had formerly published, yet you know some of these were thought very exceptionable. And in prudence perhaps I ought to have suppressed them. I there introduce a skeptic, this means like Philo, who is indeed refuted and at last gives up the argument, yet before he is silenced he advances several topics which will give great umbrage and will be deemed very bold and free. So in other words, up until his final illness, Hume had refrained from publishing the dialogues for the exact same reason that Smith refused to do so, because it would create a clamor that would prevent him from living quietly. Even the wording of their explanations is basically identical. So in my view, the more perplexing question in a way isn't why Smith refused to publish the dialogue, but rather why Hume was suddenly so adamant about publication after holding the work back for 25 years. And even more, why he sought to foist this obligation on Smith. Right? So Hume might have said, well, I have kind of one foot almost in the grave, I don't have much to lose at this point, but obviously Smith isn't in the same position. Hume knew full well that Smith was always anxious to preserve his tranquility and his privacy, his quiet. It shouldn't have taken a great feat of sympathy to realize that Smith would be averse to the public clamor that Hume himself foresaw would be provoked by the dialogues. Nor should it be forgotten that Hume asked Smith to bear this burden only a month and a half after the Wealth of Nations appeared. Right, given the many years of painstaking work that he poured into the book, the great anticipation that surrounded its release, Smith's high hopes that it would be influential in both theory and practice, this was among the worst possible times for him to become mired in public controversy. So I think all things considered, Hume's part in this exchange is more difficult to account for than Smith's. I'll stop there. I, of course, welcome comments, questions on any of the points I've raised or,
Well, thank
anything
you very
related
much.
to the book.
Thank you very much. So Adam Smith began his every lecture with a prayer.
Yes, the devout were still left unhappy because they smack so much of natural religion. The one quote where, all the students, the presumptuous strictlings think that they can get everything through reason, they don't need revelation. But he opened every class with a prayer.
This should be told to our friends in the economics department. Well, questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Could you explain a little further where the humans didn't think morality came from faith, and maybe Smith didn't think so either? Where they thought it came from?
Yes, so they just think it comes from us, from human sentiments, from the sentiment of approval or approbation. So I'll start with Hume. Hume says the virtues are things that we approve of. What do we approve of? Things that are useful or agreeable to ourselves or to others. And that's all morality is for him, is something that helps people's lives go better. Now, one kind of common misinterpretation there to say that morality comes from human sentiments, people assume that means that simply whatever feels right to me is right for me. Obviously, that's as good as having no moral theory at all, right? The fact that I feel like killing my enemy in a fit of rage doesn't mean that it's moral for me to do so. So Hume wants to correct for these types of errors by having people adopt what he calls the general point of view or the common point of view. And so he says you have to think about, kind of from a third-party standpoint, what the effects that your actions would have on any person who has commerce with the person you consider. I can't remember the exact phrase. Smith says something, it's not phrased identically, but it's a pretty similar point, that the morality is moral right and wrong are established by the sentiments of an impartial spectator, meaning a disinterested, fully informed third party. Whatever this person would think in a certain situation is right. So that, morality just simply comes from us, from human sentiments.
But neither useful and agreeable, neither risky, noble, or demanding.
Although, courage, he says, is, agreeable, yes, but only insofar as it's agreeable. Yeah.
What was some of the... Was it the letter to Strahan that was a controversial thing? What were some of the more intelligent criticisms of that? You mentioned Burke and so on as critics of this. So I'd be interested to hear what they had to say. And secondly, related to this, because it sounds like he was presenting Hume as, you said, the exemplar of virtue. I think you meant moral virtue. Are you convinced by that? I mean, did he lead a life that was especially morally impressive?
Okay, so let me start with the second question first. So Hume is, by all accounts, one of the best-natured philosophers who ever lived. And, most philosophers, you read about their lives, and they're very quirky and sometimes downright nasty people. I see your copy of Rousseau there. I like Rousseau too. He's not a great, personal, in person. I don't think he was that likable. Hume was very likable. He was, of course, hated because of his irreligion, but those who got to know him well, and in France, he was universally where irreligion was less of a strike against you, and in Britain, he was universally known as le bon vivant. Everybody loved him. So Smith concludes his letter by saying that Hume approaches nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. And so this is the line that really gets him into trouble. The attack is led by this guy named George Horne, who's a very prominent, he later became a bishop, very prominent cleric. His letter was reprinted, it came out just a couple months after the letter of Strahan. It was reprinted a couple more times that year, bunches of times in the succeeding years. It was really quite a popular work. The title had the derisive title, A Letter to Adam Smith on the Death of His Friend David Hume by One of the People Called Christians. And again, very popular. It was, to me, very kind of snide. He begs the whole question of issue. He basically says, you're saying that Hume is, this moral exemplar, but he couldn't have been a moral exemplar because he's an atheist. Well, again, that begs the whole question. The question is, can an atheist be a moral exemplar? So this is the most extensive, most popular work. There are a bunch of anonymous or signed only with initials pieces in various journals. There are lots of comments, as you might imagine, from Samuel Johnson and James Boswell. Both are, Boswell at one point says this is a piece of daring effrontery. Johnson, you should step forth and knock Hume's and Smith's heads together and make vain and ostentatious infidelity exceeding ridiculous. We should crush such noxious weeds in the moral garden, or something like this. I know this so well because it's one of the epigraphs of the book. I said we know what Burke thought. This is secondhand through Boswell. Boswell quotes Burke as saying, kind of laughing about Hume's My Own Life in Smith's letter to Strahan, saying, this was written for the members of their church, meaning the church of freethinkers, non-believers. Members of no church use more art for their credit. Here's a guy who's been, setting himself up to die well, and he does it, and, this great big deal is made out of it. Most people die easily. Why are we making such a big deal about the fact that Hume dies calmly, courageously, without the belief in it afterward? And it goes, mid-19th century, people are still saying, this is the most, gross example of infidelity in the entire range of English literature. People are still really pissed, 8 decades later. It's amazing how big of a role this played in Smith's reputation at the time, and plays no role at all. Almost nobody even knows this episode. Again, even Smith scholars. Everybody knows that there's something happened, again, because of the line I quoted, the very violent attack line. So everybody knows that something happened, but when I talk with very prominent Smith scholars, they say, oh yeah, what was that abuse that he faced? And going through it was enlightening to me.
So just quickly, when Smith describes Hume as outstanding in virtue, he means pleasant or agreeable to be around.
Yeah, so the whole final paragraph is kind of discussing Hume's character. He said, Himmel says, stresses how much Hume hit a kind of Aristotelian golden mean where, he's gentle and fun-loving, but he's also, works really hard and is really smart. And, he gives all these examples of where, where he balances all the different virtues. But yeah, and the thing he most emphasizes is his capacity for friendship, how much he was loved by the people around him, and yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. First of all, thank you for a very interesting paper. I don't know much about these. It's very interesting to hear about these two, the lives of these two figures. So my 2 questions. One is about your point 6, so the first of your most substantial contributions, and then the other is about point 7. About point 6, about Smith's religious views and how they're similar to Hume's, and how he hid those during his professorship. It kind of was kind of covered up his skepticism a little bit in order to retain his position. So my question is, how does that allow us to understand his political thoughts or his moral thought better? So how does that kind of give a new interpretation of his of his philosophical positions, or maybe in a sort of more historical sense, can we generalize this position that Smith adopted? So one thought I had, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but maybe more scholars in the second half of the 18th century did this, so kind of hit their skepticism towards philosophy or towards religion in order to keep their position. So.
Okay, so that's actually a bunch of things I want to say about that, but can I answer this one before your second one? Okay, so first of all, just to clarify, I'm not claiming full-blown, Smith wrote esoterically. There are clues in here that, we can, he gives the clues to careful readers what his true views were and so forth. In fact, Smith is one of the thinkers, even Arthur Melzer in his recent book on esotericism singles out Smith as one of the few thinkers in the history of philosophy to raise this possibility and dismiss it. He kind of raises the possibility, but that people wrote with a double doctrine, saying one thing to one group and another to another. And Smith says this is something that no man in his senses could be expected to do. That this is just no one would do this. Now, maybe this is covering up for the fact that he really did it or something. But I read him as trying to say what he means and mean what he says. But I think it's mostly just a matter of reading carefully, right? It's almost always phrased, it seems God does this, we believe God does that, or whatever. Because he's not, the book isn't about God. The book is about moral philosophy. It's trying to explain our moral feelings and our moral judgments. And, what we believe about God, of course, sheds quite a lot of light on that. And so this is what he's concerned about, is our beliefs, not about what's really true out there in the book. So how much we can or should generalize this, I don't know. I suspect to some degree, yes. Most people who are irreligious probably didn't come out and say, I'm an atheist. I just, wouldn't happen. But
yeah, but maybe so. Basically, what I'm asking, what is the philosophical or historical upshot of establishing that Smith did this, or that Smith wasn't as religious as we would like him to be? So it could be that by the 18th century. A lot of controversy around Hume was exactly revolving around the fact that he said what other people thought but people couldn't do or didn't feel like they should do. So that Hume was almost kind of made a very Machiavelli move, maybe in the sense that he was proclaiming a morality or kind of a view of life that a lot of people knew about but kind of kept under the. But I'm not sure,
maybe, although people were so offended by Hume that, so that I'm not entirely sure about that. The people were so offended by Hume that they were offended by the fact that Smith was friends with Hume, right? So one of the things that was really found so damning about the letter to Strahan, that this was Smith, this guy who we all respected, he was a professor, he was teaching our children, for God's sake, right? So I think the pious had basically long since written off Hume as an incorrigible infidel. Yes, he's going to die without belief, but we've written him off long ago. I think the real scandal is that Smith, of all people, proceeds to rub their noses in it, and I think that's what really causes the scandal. And he doesn't, I should say, the letter to Strahan, he doesn't particularly highlight Hume's impiety. He doesn't say, Hume died without any sense of belief or whatever. James Boswell's final interview, really does hammer this home. He really does a really brash anti-religious tone in his famous interview with Boswell. Smith doesn't, but the fact was that everybody knew Hume was a skeptic and was looking for, they took just the mere fact that he could die well and was seen as a scandal in and of itself. So Smith doesn't kind of refer to God or the afterlife or one way or another in the letter to Strahan. And I do think this sheds light on the character of his moral theory more broadly. Again, I don't think he was an atheist. I don't think he saw religion as dangerous. Hume did. Hume thought religion was generally detrimental with respect to morals. I don't think Smith did. He thinks that if you believe that the kind of moral rules your society has formed come from the deity, you have more reason to hold them sacred. One way I put it in the book that I was particularly proud of is that Smith sees religion not as a foundation for morality or even a pillar, but rather a buttress. It provides support from the outside, right? It kind of just gives you another reason act morally. And I think that, that's one other possible reason why Smith wasn't openly irreligious, is he thought this did provide a buttress for morality, and he didn't want to weaken that buttress.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's a nice kind of way that it ties into his philosophy. So that's really interesting. Now, my other question about point 7, I was just struck by your by the phrase of living quietly, or the
Disturbing my quiet.
yeah, exactly, the desire to live a tranquil life that Smith had. And I was wondering whether we should take that for granted, or whether we should maybe question that a little bit. So maybe the point, or the objective of Smith wasn't to live quietly, but to be successful in his professional life. So maybe there's kind of an ambition behind this that he doesn't want to explicate, because that's not very decorous. And maybe that made me think about kind of maybe the different ambitions that Hume and Smith had, that they felt like they could explicate more than they, or Hume felt like he could tell more about his personal views than he maybe should have, because he had different ambitions than Smith. Maybe he was more so himself more as a making a philosophical contribution that shook the world, where Smith wanted to grow in the institutions of Euclid. I'm not sure.
Well, so just to clarify, at this point when he writes the letter to Strahan, he's no longer a professor. After only 12 years at the University of Glasgow, he gives up his professorship to become a tutor to young Duke. He takes the Duke on a grand tour of Europe, and then he has basically a pension that he lives on while he's writing The Wealth of Nations. So I think I take your point, but I twist it a little bit, that there would be less ambition for himself, that he wanted some job. He did get a kind of almost menial bureaucratic job as a customs officer for the last years of his life, but that, I'm sure he wasn't holding his breath for that at this point. I think if it's, it would be ambition for his work or his ideas. So as I suggested, he's just published The Wealth of Nations, just, right before the dialogues, before Hume asked him to take on the dialogues. And I can see him saying, I don't want my name associated with this, and then to have people dismiss The Wealth of Nations, all my ideas I've spent decades working on, for the sake of, me doing this for Hume, when Hume, you didn't do it yourself for so long. So I guess I twist it less about professional ambition than ambition for his ideas, I think is...
That's not a very honorable motive. And it would seem to me you provided a more honorable motive when you said that he felt that perhaps belief in the deity helped to sustain a moral society, which he was very concerned about. And why should he then want to be responsible for bringing to life a probably very effective attack on something he thought was important? Now that would have been, I think, a noble reason not to do it.
Well, I think both could be true and very likely were true. I guess I don't necessarily agree that it would have been dishonorable. I mean, so from Smith's point of view, he thinks the current mercantilist system is harming everybody, including and especially the poor of Britain. To have, this kind of biggest attack ever on the mercantilist system, the one that actually did help to turn the tide toward free trade once Pitt becomes minister, to say that, well, I'll just forget all this stuff because, Hume asked me to do this when he didn't do it himself for 25 years. I don't know that it's dishonorable to want your ideas to have an impact on the world if you think they're going to be beneficial. I mean, I think both sets could be true and perfectly noble.
Excuse the materialist bathos, but is there enough evidence to know what was Smith's finance at the time? Because this is before he had the bestseller, and after Hume had his bestseller. Because Hume he was living on the history of Britain, or history of England as we call it today, and that's before the Wealth of Nations is published. So it's almost tempting to just look at the balance and Smith saying, how long can I live on my own resources after this?
No, he's not struggling that much. He had a pretty generous pension from the Charles Townsend, who was the Duke's father. He was living okay.
Right. And the other thing, the model, the obituary, as it were. Mm-hmm. The models that were available, of course, there was a Christian death, and that was not really appropriate. And the other thing is Socratic death. So it seems, he gives him a Platonic send away, that's the model.
Very much so. In fact, I suggest in the book that this concluding line that he approaches nearly the idea of perfectly wise and virtuous man is best, nature of human frailty or created. This sounds a lot like what Phaedo says in the Plato's account of Socrates' death, the last lines of the dialogue sound a lot like this. So, I mean, I think it was pretty deliberate. He's comparing his friend's death with one of the most iconic deaths in the whole Western tradition. And this is pretty audacious, but again, it's more just saying that he was a good guy despite being a skeptic that got him into big trouble. But no, I think there are Platonic overtones, and he's very deliberately bringing those up.
Right, so granting that then, and you talked about one of the greatest friendships in philosophy, or was a great one in Plato and Socrates, because we would have known about Hume without Smith, we would not have known about Socrates without Plato. How do you see Smith as interpreting his own moral obligation or fealty, as it were, towards Hume in Platonic terms, as carrying on, but you don't have to be precise, and you don't have to say everything that's separate, and Plato didn't, because Plato was, it was a very Platonic interpretation.
So first of all, on the friendship thing, yeah, I mean, this is what everybody, whenever I say that Hume and Smith was the greatest friendship in the history of philosophy, everybody says Socrates and Plato. There are 4 full decades between them. I mean, it seems likely that it's more kind of mentor, protege, teacher, student than friend. I mean, what is Plato, 29 when Socrates dies? So, maybe by the very end, but anyway, this is a full lifelong, 25-year thing. In any case, so yeah, there's one scholarly article claiming essentially that in the letter to Strahan that Smith is playing the Plato to Hume Socrates. I don't know. I mean, Hume wrote a lot. He wrote a lot more than Smith did, as opposed to nothing like Socrates did. So it's not, kind of trying to bring out the importance of Hume's thought. Hume did that very well for himself. And, it's almost more like an Aristotle-Plato thing. Smith is agreeing with a lot, most of the big things that Hume says, but he's always kind of tweaking. He says, he got that big part right, but what about this? And there's always some way that he's extending or modifying what Hume does. So I guess every relationship is different, but I kind of see it in that way.
I like the friendship of Aristotle and Plato that you just mentioned.
That too, 40 years apart, same 4 decades.
But we know it's a friendship because that's what Aristotle said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in doing so, he said he gave it the basis for all friendship, which is love of the truth. I love the truth more than my friend Plato.
Well, it's fun. Smith very much echoes Aristotle's account of friendship in the theory of moral sentiments, and he gives it an account of friendship that's very Aristotelian in lots of respects.
I wanted to ask about your 4th or 5th point, I can't remember which, the one about the wealth of nations, political economy. I just sort of have flipped through the chapter. And specifically about the division of labour, which seems to me, I mean, Smith didn't write very much about this, that's one thing.
Smith didn't?
Sorry,
Yeah,
Hume didn't.
Almost nothing, yes.
Yeah. There's that essay, the Oratory essay. And in that, I haven't read it for a while, but from memory, there is no division of labour. He does talk about different things that people do, but in a way that,
No, yes, it's good.
and so, as far as I can tell, the claims you're making in that chapter are, they both talked about free trade, and they both talked about commerce being good for peace, effectively.
Liberty, security,
etc. And that wasn't a completely uncommon thing to say in that period of time. So, if the crucial concept in Smith is labour theory of value, and then also, even probably more importantly, the division of labour, and that's not in Hume, what exactly is your historical claim about Hume's importance for Smith in relation to political economy that's not just they both said the same thing? Because to my mind, Smith's talking to the physiocrats, and they're talking about land, and he's saying, no, that gets it all wrong, division of labour, and of course there's more to it than that, but that's really what he cares about. So.
Good, that's an excellent question. So I try to be careful not to say that I think Hume is pretty clearly Smith's main interlocutor in the theory of moral sentiments. He never brings him up by name for reasons we can talk about, but a great deal of the moral theory is drawing on, modifying Hume. In The Wealth of Nations, I think it's a lot harder to say. I mean, it's a very sprawling book if there's any one main interlocutor or one source. He I think, brings up Hume by name 5 times. At one point, he quotes 4 straight paragraphs of the History of England to kind of take it on the question of the church establishment. So I don't say that I try not to say that Hume kind of caused or influenced Smith's views, but that rather that he anticipated them. So another reason I say this is that Dugald Stewart, who's their slightly younger contemporary and Smith's first biographer, says in his biography that Smith was always really anxious to assert his originality on free trade, that kind of I came up with this idea on my own, I didn't steal it from anybody else, and that he said it as early as his lectures in Edinburgh, which are even before Hume published his discourses. So I try to talk about it more in terms of Hume anticipating Smith than influencing or being the source for Smith. That said, I do, you said it, well, there are just these 2 points, but I do think these are 2 of the central points of the Wealth of Nations, right? That the most famous argument in the Wealth of Nations is argument about free trade, and this isn't a common thing in their time. There's some thought, as you say, the physiocrats have the word laissez-faire and so forth, but this is still running against the mercantilist impulses of virtually every politician and most people who write on commercial matters. So I do think Hume is one of the first clear arguments for free trade, and then Smith expands it and makes it much more prominent and in some ways more powerful. But I do think it's telling that Hume anticipates this by a couple decades. And then what I argue is the most important passage in the whole book, the passage where he says commerce and introduce order and good government, and with them the liberty and security of individuals. This is the kind of climactic claim of Book 3. And he says directly right there that this has been the most important of all, this has been the least observed, is by far the most important of all of commerce's effects. And this is why I say it's so important. He says, this is by far the most important of all the effects that commerce has had, is introducing liberty and security. And immediately after that, he says, Mr. Hume is the only writer who I know has taken notice of this. That's a little bit weird because Locke had, Montesquieu had, whatever. He may be talking more about the specific mechanism by which commerce introduces liberty and government, the kind of fall of the nobles, they're squandering their money on luxuries, where Hume did say that pretty clearly in his History of England. But that there, at least he himself is acknowledging Hume as anticipating what I see as the central argument. So yeah, no, there are definite ways he expands on Hume. I mean, Hume just writes a handful of essays on economics. There's nothing like a massive 900-page treatise. There's lots of ways in which Smith expands on tax policy and the roles of government, and you rightly point out the division of labor is one of them. Hume has kind of 1 or 2 offhand mentions of the partition of employment in the treatise and elsewhere, but nothing like the central importance that Smith gives it. So no, that's definitely one place where Smith modifies, expands on Hume. But again, I think that the fact that the most important argument in the book and the most famous argument in the book are both anticipated by Hume. I was just trying to give Hume a little bit more credit, right? He's seen as this kind of minor figure, minor predecessor. Those are big points that he made before Smith did, so let's give some credit where credit is due.
Just one quick follow-up question.
Sure.
The Dugald Stewart, the way I couldn't quite catch what you're saying. Were you saying that Dugald Stewart says, Hume was more important than Smith says on? Because of course he does say that, and he would say that, being the chair of...
Sorry, say that again?
Dugald Stewart, the biographer.
Right.
What did Dugald Stewart say about Smith's Hume relationship
I see.
to Smith?
Well, I guess 2 things. One, he does say that Smith drew on lots of thinkers, Hutcheson, their friend James Oswald of Sonnecker, who nobody knows anymore, but that Hume's discourses had more effect on Smith than any other book or something like this. But he also says they confirmed Smith in those liberal views that had already opened up in the course of his researches, and then he goes on to say, what I had said to you before, is that Smith, according to Stewart, was always really eager to assert his originality, saying, I didn't take this from Hume, I didn't take this from anyone, this is my idea, right? So Stewart quotes a couple of lines from We No Longer Have It, but from lectures that Smith delivered in Edinburgh before he even became a professor at Glasgow, where he says, little else is necessary to produce prosperity than, peace, a government that provides security and easy taxes, everything else comes on its own, or something like that. I'm not going to write it all, but something like this. So that, again, Stewart is saying Hume influenced him more than anyone else did. Still, Smith got the free trade idea before Hume did. That's what Stewart says.
So insofar as Smith got all of this abuse after Hume's death before writing that letter, how long did that last? And was Smith tarnished with the sort of were people whispering that he was a skeptic too? Was it harming his influence in any way, or did that peter out?
So, yes, there was lots of whispering. That well, more than whispering. There are lots of comments that I quote in the book where people are saying, I can't believe he did this. Here we thought he was one of the good guys. He was a professor of moral philosophy, and it turns out, he was kind of a secret Humean all along, and so forth. It did. I mean, lucky for him. Talking about the ambition or whatever. Luckily for him, it didn't really cause the wealth of nations to sink into oblivion the way that he might have feared. Hence the line. The letter on Hume brought on me 10 times more abuse than the Wealth of Nations did, right? The Wealth of Nations actually, given how many vested interests he took on, didn't bring him that much abuse. It was relatively well received, and as it became, a lot of his arguments became official government policy within his lifetime. There's a famous scene, it's probably apocryphal, I bring it up very briefly in the book, where Smith comes he's in London and he goes to see Pitt and all of his top ministers, and they all stand up to greet him, and he says, "Oh, sit down," and they say, "No, we'll wait till you're first seated, for we are all your scholars," or something like this. So he's still clearly influential, he still, has the ear of the government and so forth, but, the pious are left uneasy. There's one I didn't mention it, one of my favorite letters is a letter written by Theodore Tronson, who's a pretty prominent physician in Geneva, sent his son to Glasgow expressly to study with Smith, but he's aware that Smith is friends with Hume, and so he writes a letter to his son where he says, go to Glasgow, take Smith's course, learn everything you can, but I would rather see you die than to adopt Hume's principles, or something like this. So study with Smith, but don't get too wrapped up in that side of things. There was worry, but happily for him, wasn't enough to keep him from being influential in the ways he wanted to be influential.
I've always been interested in the question of politeness. I don't know whether you discuss this
in what
very much.
respect?
In Hume's essays and the reaction that he apparently got from Rousseau on this in the first discourse on the rise of the arts and sciences, where Rousseau attacks the insincerity of politeness, or I like your word, decorous. Get decorous. So I'm wondering whether there's any politeness in Adam Smith, and also, in reference to this discussion, and especially in connection with the importance of sympathy. Because if you're sympathetic to someone, there has to be some communication or contact, and politeness seems to be based on a reserve, where you hold yourself back from too much intimate contact with, or frank avowal. That's what Rousseau didn't like, was the insincerity of politeness. And it might seem that this would get in the way of sympathy. Or on the other hand, it might help sympathy, like the impartial spectator of Adam Smith. That is also a somewhat standoffish attitude.
So Smith mostly talks about it in terms of propriety, but I think he means a lot of what you mean by politeness. So this is the subject of the whole part one of the theory of moral sentiments. He sees sympathy, which he sees as an innate thing, right? That he just takes it as a brute fact about human nature, that we sympathize with others and that we want mutual sympathy, that we want to be on the same emotional page as other people. And this fact, that he just takes to be a fact about human nature, he sees as the source of our standards for propriety. Meaning, you and I want to be on the same emotional page. We both derive pleasure from being on the same emotional page. As a consequence, when I feel something really strongly, I should and naturally led to kind of dampen the expression of this feeling, because I know you won't feel it as strongly just by seeing me. I win the lottery rather than jumping for joy. I'm excited, but you're not going to be as excited about me winning the lottery as I am, so I dampen it down. You know that I'm going to feel more strongly than you do as the observer, so you try to enter into my feelings more fully, raise the pitch of yours, so that we kind of meet somewhere in the middle. So he talks about propriety being, coming from sympathy and from the desire for mutual sympathy, there are more worries in Smith than in Hume about these standards being, inauthentic in a Rousseauian way. Not nearly as much as Rousseau. He thinks, for the most part, this is what makes society run harmoniously, and for the most part, this is a good thing. Whereas Rousseau says, we're just all play acting all the time, and nobody's really sincere and the like. Smith thinks, gives examples of when this happens, but for the most part, he thinks interaction with other people makes us better, not worse. That we're more likely to be self-absorbed and kind of suffer from self-deceit. These are going to be greater problems if we spend less time around people. That just being around others makes us better, it makes us act with propriety.
There's a book that came out recently by a Frenchman, Philippe Renaud, called La Politesse. Which goes through all of these Enlightenment thinkers.
French Enlightenment thinkers, or
no,
Scots?
English and
Okay.
French.
I don't know.
Interesting too, I think. And it's important for for the Enlightenment.
Okay.
That's all we have.
Well, I'll ask quickly, what's the relationship between resentment and justice?
First step.
Yeah.
He thinks resentment is the source of justice. I mean, and this is one of the areas where, Smith's views seem to me, most of what Smith says I see as an improvement on Hume, where he criticizes Hume's moral theory. I think much of what he says is right. Here's one where it seems to me a little bit kind of archaic or backward even. He says, so first of all, what do they mean by justice? They both mean nothing more or less than refraining from harming the life, liberty, or property of somebody else, right? So it's not, they don't use justice in the kind of expansive sense that, everyone from Plato to Rawls does, that it means fairness or desert or something. It just means not harming other people's life, liberty, or possessions. Hume says, where does this come from? Well, there's no kind of natural impulse to do this, to refrain from harming one another, that we have to learn this, and the only reason we learn it is because it's useful, and this is why notoriously in the treatise calls it an artificial virtue. It's something that we human beings have to construct and create and punish people when they don't act this way, because there's no natural motive to it. Smith says that it is a natural virtue and that it springs from the sentiment of resentment. And so the idea is, why do we punish people for breaking the rules of justice? It's not because they say, oh, you murdered this person or you stole this person's life savings. Well, in the long run, this is really going to hurt society, so we ought to punish this to prevent people from doing it, kind of deterrence, reasons. Smith says, no, we resent it. We see, you murdered this person for no reason. I resent it. I want to punish you. You stole this person's life savings. I resent it. I want to punish. So that it springs from resentment. I mean, this, to me, again, seems like it's punishment for kind of retaliation, in a way that I think most of us would see as archaic or even barbaric. But this is what his criticism on Hume here is that justice doesn't come from abstract reflection on the good of society as a whole, but rather resentment in particular instances of injustice that we see.
So it's not resentment at something that a harm has been done to you. It's
It could be, but it could be. He also just thinks that we would naturally, even two strangers, I see one stranger do something unjust to another, I would resent on behalf of that stranger, of course more for yourself, for your family or friends, but even strangers, we just naturally resent acts of injustice.
And coming back a little bit to politeness, yes, I think Hume's stress on politeness made a distinction between the politeness of modern ethics, as opposed to the ancients, who were too forthright and frank. And whereas, and so this makes me think that Hume had a greater eye towards the ancients, whereas it seems that Adam Smith had a greater eye towards the contrast with feudalism, medieval times, with the wealth of nations begins with this attack on hospitality, on free lunches, like the one we're going to get. Yes. and then mercantilism too. It seems to be the have a feudal basis to work background.
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of the wealth of nations, right, what I said was the central argument and central line in the whole book, this climactic claim of Book 3, is very much about how commercial society brought in, liberty, security, independence in a way that didn't exist for almost anyone in the feudal era. I think the contrast with the feudal era is absolutely central for Smith. Yeah. And in part because, I mean, he sees the operations of this still in his own bag. The Scottish Highlands are not that far away, right? He sees the contrast between kind of commercial, polite, civilized Athens Edinburgh and Glasgow, compares it to the barbaric Scottish Highlands with the kind of remnants of feudalism. I mean, I think this is a big part of what's motivating.
Yeah, on second thought, I'm now thinking against myself that Hume may have had a good deal to say against feudalism.
Oh, absolutely, in the history of England. Yes, the barons are the chief villains in the history of England, even more than the clergy are the biggest villains in the history of England. Yeah.
I guess one question I have again about a difference possibly between like moral philosophy respectively. There's always this question about to what degree is Smith's moral philosophy stoic in some way, and there's much less of that, it seems, in Hume. So it's often much easier to read Smith as taking on these stoic influences, but is there that strand in Hume, or is that another partial?
So this is a contrast that's often drawn. I don't talk about it much in the book, partly because it's a whole, kind of scholarly side that when I'm trying to tell a story, it would take me down a long and complicated path. But there's a common thing to draw a contrast between kind of Hume, the neo-Epicurean, and Smith, the neo-Stoic. I think it's probably overdrawn on a number of counts. First of all, I don't read the Epicureans and Stoics as quite as different as a lot of people. I mean, they're both striving for tranquility through virtue. I mean, they're different, certainly the Stoics had more belief in God, and I think that was the biggest thing that people meant in the 18th century when they contrasted the two. But a lot, I think Smith's affinity to the Stoics has probably been overstated. He himself says that the Stoic plan is altogether different from the one that kind of human nature presents. So he says a lot of nice things about it too, but he says some more critical things. One of the other things I suggest, and this is more conjectural, is the kind of big Stoic sections, what are thought to be the sections influenced most by the Stoics, are the ones added in the 6th edition in 1790, right before he dies. And a big part of that is an emphasis on self-command that wasn't there in the earlier sections. And the importance of self-command for basically any of the virtues. You have to, command your passions in order to carry out any of the virtues that prudence, benevolence, justice, etc. Any of the virtues he talks about in the book. And again, it's usually taken for granted that this is derived from the Stoics. Now, one of the things he says there is, self-command is particularly impressive. When you're dying, he says this right after having all but cited Hume on the connection between beauty and utility. This is just I think, plausible hypothesis, but I say one possible source of this emphasis on self-command could be the self-command that Hume showed at his death, rather than the Stoics, as is always assumed. There's no kind of slam dunk that this is the case, but I give a couple of kind of textual reasons to believe that might be at least part of the story.
Yeah, I also just thought about one of the trends in scholarship on Smith is to show how he was, in some senses, conservative, more conservative than people sometimes make him out to be. It's kind of showing that he's not a neoliberal in the modern sense. Yeah. So I wonder how you situate yourself to that line of thought, and then especially in respect to your argument that he's maybe not as religious as we sometimes make him out to be.
So that's, I'd say, the two biggest, most raging debates in Smith scholarship today are the religion question, and then the debate between, they can become known as left Smithians and right Smithians, right? Kind of, would he be on the left or the right of today's political spectrum? In some ways this is silly, there was no left and right. Left and right comes from the French Revolution after he dies. it can still be useful to try to think, what parts of his thought would place him on the spectrum today. And there are definitely parts that would place him, that would push him in both directions. So on the kind of more right side, he is, this is so of course often caricatured as a kind of strict libertarian, night watchman, state type person. I think that is a caricature. The truth in it is he does think that government tends to be extraordinarily wasteful, that politicians are often inept or corrupt, that, when you can avoid having a central government doing things, that's better, because they're going to mess stuff up a lot of the time. On the other hand, one of the central arguments about the wealth of nations is about providing for the poor. He argued, at least implicitly, supports trade unions, explicitly supports progressive taxation, or income taxes in his time, but progressive poll taxes and house rents and the like. I wrote an article for the APSR a year and a half ago called Adam Smith on What's Wrong with Economic Inequality. So I argue that he's not just concerned with poverty, but inequality itself, that inequality corrupts our moral sentiments. We're more likely to sympathize with the rich and the poor, and the rich don't tend to be very admirable people, so it's problematic that we admire them. This undermines our virtue, this undermines our happiness. And it's hard, how to put this? So in his day, he sees free trade, getting rid of mercantilism, as helping the poor, right? What are all the government interventions in the economy in his time? Systematically helping merchants and manufacturers at the expense of consumers, giving the East India Company a monopoly on tea so that tea's more expensive for people to buy, right? So get rid of all these restrictions and, ordinary consumers' lives are better off. You can solve poverty and get rid of government, win-win. So now what do you say about government programs designed to help the poor? That's hard to say, right? Is it distrust of government, or is the desire to help the poor more fundamental? I don't know that there's a way to answer that question.
Yeah, so when I said neoliberal and conservative, I should specify, because I actually didn't mean so much in terms of left and right in the modern sense, because that's obviously a difficult exercise, but more in terms of what did he see as kind of moral foundations that prop up a society kind of more. If it's not, if religion is just, as you said, kind of sort of an external help, how do you situate yourself to that debate? Kind of what Smith sees as the moral supports, kind of the moral underpinnings of a society.
Oh, so here he's one of the more optimistic thinkers in the liberal tradition. He thinks kind of human nature does this. We don't need an oppressive church to make people behave well. We don't need a kind of Rousseauian denaturing. We don't need any of that kind of stuff. Just the workings of sympathy get us to act, not perfectly, of course, but more or less morally, more or less most of the time. That there are definite things you can do to corrupt it. Faction, fanaticism. Again, I argue that maybe even too much inequality can corrupt this. But he doesn't see the kind of Burkean need for supports, external supports to human nature. He thinks human nature just kind of does it on its own.
Okay.
Did he believe in original sin?
No. He never comes out and says it, but he never, his writings wouldn't seem to suggest it. Things are too, not perfectly ordered once again, but things are too well ordered that we need, kind of salvation from the world.
Are we going to end on that point? All right, thanks so much.
Thank you all.